Hi, it's been a while. 4 years into this hobby, 2 years after building my first hand-wired keyboard, and more than 10 hand-wired boards later, I designed a PCB keyboard, and I call it the Koshō. The main reason why I made this PCB keyboard was because I wanted a reliable hot swappable keyboard. Hand-wired keyboards tend to have wire connection issues, and once you put in the switches, that's what you'll have to live with. So here's the story of how I made the Koshō keyboard. I followed Scotto Keeb's KeyCAD tutorial as my starting point. Then I remembered I wanted the board to support both MX and chalk low profile switches, so I got a hybrid footprint from XCMKB. They also suggested using Easy EDA plus JLC PCB because apparently it's much more easier to use than KeyCAD. But anyway, I did everything from scratch in Easy EDA. Once the placements were done, it was time to route the wire traces. Thankfully, Easy EDA had an auto router to do this, but I later found out the router had a tough time to route because I had outlines and top layers that were in the way of the connections, so a little on that later. So once the PCB design was done, it was a simple click for the design to be uploaded to JLC PCB. Select the PCB settings, yada yada yada, and submit. I had to resubmit the PCB design 3 times because JLC PCB's engineer said there were outlines and top layers that made the production impossible. After removing the outlines and top layers, rerouting the traces just took a couple of minutes and the traces looked better and much more simpler. It cost me about $26 plus shipping for 5 boards, but it was like $100 in my country's currency. It took about 5 days for the PCB to be produced, and it was cool to see the steps for the PCB while in production. So the PCBs have arrived. Nice. And now it's time to assemble the PCB. First thing to solder were the diodes. I found out there's a printable jig to bend the diode legs, and this helped a lot to make sure that I have a standardized length for all the diode legs. Next was to solder the LEDs. These things were small to solder. I should have used hot air for this, but I don't have that hot air solder thing, so I just soldered this with my soldering iron. After that were the hot swap sockets. This was kind of straightforward. Solder the pads, solder one hot swap leg, then solder the other while pushing the socket down. And lastly was the RP2040 MCU. Originally, I wanted to socket this so I can remove the MCU in the future. So let's say if I wanted to abandon the keyboard and use the same MCU for another build, I could have done so. But later I found out the pin contacts weren't connecting properly after removing and attaching the magnetic cable a couple of times, so I just soldered the MCU directly to the PCB. Once the soldering is done, now it's time to make the firmware to test the connections. Thankfully, since I've made so many hand-wired keyboards, it was a matter of copy-pasting the source codes from one of them and make a new board. I also had to go through the Vial tutorial to port the QMK firmware to Vial in case someone wants to use this keyboard for their own use. So next up is the keyboard case. I used Fusion 360 to design the keyboard case. Case design was another part of the build that took so much time to do. I made 6 or 7 versions of the case, the first one with a half transparent bottom and the ones after that with a full transparent bottom case, as I couldn't get the half transparent case to glue together well. I don't have them fancy Bamboo Labs multi-filament printers because I'm just too poor. Since I connect all my keyboards with a magnetic USB cable and wanted the magnetic USB head to be flush with the case, I had to solder the PCB first and then measure it and put that into my design. I think this design and printing took about 2 to 3 weeks of trial and error just for that MCU to be flush. Once I'm happy with the case, it's time to put on the trackpad. The trackpad has its own trackpad holder that elevates the trackpad to just about the same height of the keycaps for a somewhat uniform height. Once the case was done, it was time to put in the key switches and keycaps. The last part was to connect and place the trackpad onto the trackpad holder, then stick the trackpad cover on top. I made 2 builds of the keyboard. The first one uses Harimau tactile MX switches with MT3 keycaps from Drop. And the second companion keyboard, which I call the Koshō, uses low-profile Kale Deep Sea Whale Mini Silent tactile switches with LAK keycaps from Giselle Funder. And the specs for the keyboards are these. Between the low profile and normal switch build, I personally prefer the silent low profile build as I bring the keyboard to the office and want to remain as unnoticeable as possible. Typing feel can't be compared to premium builds with gaskets, aluminium case, brass blades, lubed and filmed, Franken switches, whatnot. But since I've grown accustomed to using 40% keyboards, the slightly separated halves make it much more comfortable for my shoulders versus shorter 40% keyboards like the Reviewing or the BM40 or the Plank. The 5-degree angled profile makes the first row keys slightly nearer to my fingers and the RGB gives it a softer look. Plus I get to know if the keyboard is connected or not. So, I think this will be my last keyboard project video in a very long time because the hobby has slowed down after the pandemic has ended and I have 2 additional kids to look after instead of sacrificing my weekends and sleep time. Anyways, thank you for watching. If this video was useful for you, maybe leave a like. See you again someday. Bye.